A millionaire sees a child crying desperately while his mother cleans tombstones to survive. Before we dive into the story, drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. The autumn wind swept through Evergreen Cemetery, rustling the fallen leaves that carpeted the ground between weathered tombstones. Richard Blackwood stood motionless before his parents' grave, his tall figure casting a long shadow across the marble headstone. At 52, Richard had built an empire worth billions, yet he stood alone in the cemetery, the sole mourner on the anniversary of his mother's passing. He placed a single white rose on the grave, his expression unchanged, stoic, controlled, distant. 15 years had passed, but Richard maintained this ritual with the same precision he applied to his business dealings. No emotion, just obligation fulfilled. As he turned to leave, a sound pierced the cemetery's silence. A child's desperate, sobbing. Richard paused, annoyed by the interruption of his solitude. The crying continued, each wail more urgent than the last. Despite his instinct to ignore it, Richard found himself walking toward the sound. Behind a large oak tree, he found a small boy, no more than 8 years old, kneeling beside the crumpled form of a woman. The boy's clothes were clean but worn, his face streaked with tears as he shook the woman's shoulder. "Mom, please wake up." The child's voice cracked with fear. Richard stood frozen, uncertain what to do. He wasn't accustomed to dealing with strangers' problems, especially emotional ones. The boy looked up, his tear-filled eyes locking with Richard's. "Please, mister," he pleaded, scrambling to his feet and grabbing Richard's sleeve with small, desperate fingers. "My mom won't wake up. She was cleaning the stones and then she just fell. Please help her." Richard glanced around, hoping to spot a groundskeeper or another visitor, but the cemetery was deserted. The woman lay motionless on the ground, a cleaning rag still clutched in her hand, a bucket of supplies overturned beside her. "Have you called an ambulance?" Richard asked, his voice clinical, detached. The boy shook his head. "We don't have a phone," he whispered, pulling harder on Richard's expensive coat. "Please, sir, she's all I have." Something in the child's words penetrated Richard's carefully constructed walls. With a sigh, he pulled out his phone and dialed 911, reporting the emergency with efficient precision. Then, against his better judgment, he knelt beside the woman. She was young, perhaps in her early 30s, with delicate features strained by obvious exhaustion and illness. Her breathing was shallow, her skin pale and clammy. Richard loosened her collar and checked her pulse. Weak, but present. "What's your name?" he asked the boy, who hadn't released his grip on Richard's coat. "Oliver Mitchell, sir," the child answered, his voice small. "And that's my mom, Sarah." "The ambulance is coming, Oliver," Richard said, surprised by the gentleness in his own voice. "How long has your mother been ill?" Oliver's eyes widened. "How did you know she's sick?" Richard had seen enough suffering in his childhood to recognize its signs. "Just a guess," he replied. "She's been sick for a long time," Oliver whispered, as though sharing a secret. "But she still works every day. She cleans the stones so they look nice for the families." His voice swelled with pride despite his fear. "She says everyone deserves to be remembered properly." The distant wail of an ambulance broke through the cemetery's quiet. Richard stood, intending to leave now that professional help was on its way. This wasn't his problem. He had meetings to attend, deals to close. But as he turned to go, Oliver's small hand slipped into his. "Please don't leave us," the boy said, his voice breaking. "I'm scared." Richard Blackwood, the man whose cold negotiation tactics had earned him the nickname the Frost King in business circles, found himself unable to walk away from a desperate child in a cemetery. Against every instinct honed over decades of self-preservation, he nodded. "I'll stay until the ambulance comes," he said, telling himself it was merely a temporary inconvenience. He couldn't have known that this moment, this simple act of reluctant kindness, would alter the course of his life forever. The hospital corridor reeked of antiseptic and desperation. Richard sat awkwardly on a plastic chair outside the emergency room, completely out of place in his tailored suit among families in casual wear. Oliver had fallen asleep against his arm, emotionally exhausted from the ordeal. 3 hours had passed since they'd arrived in the ambulance. Richard had already canceled 2 meetings, something he never did. His phone vibrated constantly with messages from his executive assistant, but he couldn't bring himself to disturb the sleeping child. "Mr. Mitchell?" A tired-looking doctor emerged from the double doors. "Blackwood," Richard corrected, carefully shifting Oliver to wake him. "Richard Blackwood. This is Oliver Mitchell. I found them at the cemetery." The boy stirred, immediately alert. "How's my mom? Can I see her?" The doctor's expression softened, which Richard recognized as a dangerous sign. "She's stabilized, but I need to speak with a family member first." "I don't have any other family," Oliver said quickly. "Just Mom." Richard cleared his throat. "Perhaps I could speak with you, doctor," he offered, surprising himself. "While Oliver gets something from the cafeteria." He handed the boy $20. "Get yourself a sandwich, maybe a cookie. I'll come find you." Once Oliver reluctantly left, the doctor's professional facade cracked. "Ms. Mitchell is in advanced stages of lymphoma. She's refused treatment for months, probably due to cost. There's not much we can do now except manage her pain. Days, maybe weeks at most." The words hit Richard with unexpected force. "And the boy? What happens to him?" "Social services will be contacted. Foster care, most likely, unless there are relatives." Richard thanked the doctor mechanically, then found himself walking to Sarah Mitchell's room instead of the cafeteria. He wasn't sure why. She was awake, hooked to various monitors, looking frail but alert. Her eyes, the same striking blue as her son's, fixed on him with confusion. "You're not from social services," she stated weakly. "No. I found you and your son at the cemetery." Richard Blackwood. Recognition flickered in her eyes. "The Richard Blackwood? The billionaire?" He nodded uncomfortably. Sarah closed her eyes briefly. "Oliver, is he okay?" "In the cafeteria. He's fine." "But I'm not," she said, with startling directness, "and neither of us has the luxury of pretending otherwise." Richard found himself respecting her clarity. "Mr. Blackwood, I have no family. No one to take Oliver." Her voice broke. "They'll put him in the system. He's sensitive, smart. He'll be destroyed there." "Surely there's someone," Richard began. "There isn't," Sarah interrupted, suddenly gripping his hand with surprising strength. "I've spent months looking for options. There's no one." Richard tried to extricate his hand, but she held firm. "Please," she whispered. "He needs someone who can protect him. Give him a future." "Mrs. Mitchell, I barely know your son. I'm not qualified. You have resources, connections." Her eyes burned with a mother's desperate determination. "You could find him a good home, a good family. Just promise me you won't abandon him to the system." Before Richard could respond, Oliver returned, rushing to his mother's bedside. The boy's presence silenced them both. Later that night, as Sarah finally slept and Oliver dozed in a chair, Richard stood by the window, trapped by a promise he hadn't quite made to a dying woman he'd just met. Dawn was breaking when the monitors suddenly shrieked. Oliver woke with a scream as medical staff rushed in, pushing them both aside. Richard pulled the boy into the hallway, holding him back as he fought to return to his mother. But Sarah Mitchell was already gone. The drive to Richard's estate unfolded in oppressive silence. Rain pelted the windshield of his Bentley, matching the tears that silently streamed down Oliver's face as he stared blankly out the passenger window. The boy hadn't spoken since the hospital, since the moment the doctor had gently confirmed what the flat line on the monitor had already told them. Richard gripped the steering wheel tighter. What was he supposed to say? What words could possibly matter to a child who had just lost everything? He'd spent decades building walls around himself, perfecting the art of emotional distance. Now those same walls prevented him from reaching the grieving boy beside him. "We're almost there," Richard finally offered, his voice sounding foreign even to himself. Oliver didn't respond. His small hand clutched the worn backpack the hospital social worker had helped him pack, the only possessions he had after they'd stopped briefly at the tiny apartment he'd shared with his mother. The social worker had been suspicious of Richard's involvement, but couldn't argue with the temporary guardianship papers his lawyers had miraculously produced within hours. It wouldn't last forever, but it bought them time. Though for what, Richard wasn't certain. As they passed through the ornate iron gates that marked the entrance to his estate, Richard watched Oliver's eyes widen slightly. The driveway seemed endless, winding through manicured gardens before revealing the mansion, a massive Georgian structure that stood like a monument to solitary success. "You live here?" Oliver whispered, breaking his silence. "Yes," Richard replied, parking in front of the grand entrance. "It's been in my family for generations." "It looks like a castle from my books," the boy said, his voice small. Richard hadn't thought about how intimidating his home might appear to a child. The 20-room mansion had always been just a place to sleep between business trips, a symbol of achievement, not comfort. As they stepped inside, the cavernous foyer echoed with their footsteps. Mrs. Hoffman, his housekeeper for 15 years, appeared with a look of poorly concealed shock on her face. Richard had called ahead, but seeing her employer arrive with a small child was clearly still jarring. "Mrs. Hoffman, this is Oliver. He'll be staying with us for—" Richard paused, realizing he had no timeline, no plan. "For a while." "I see," she replied, recovering quickly. Her kind eyes settled on Oliver. "You must be hungry, young man. Would you like something to eat?" Oliver looked up at Richard as if seeking permission. "Go ahead," Richard encouraged. "Mrs. Hoffman makes excellent sandwiches." As the housekeeper led Oliver toward the kitchen, Richard called his assistant to clear his schedule for the next few days. The immediate crisis managed, he stood alone in his foyer, the reality of what he'd done finally sinking in. He, Richard Blackwood, had brought a child, a complete stranger, into his home, his life. A child who needed comfort, guidance, and stability, all things Richard doubted his ability to provide. What had possessed him to make such an impulsive decision? He'd built his reputation on calculated risks, not emotional reactions. Yet the memory of Sarah Mitchell's eyes filled with desperate hope as she'd begged him to keep her son safe haunted him. And the way Oliver had looked at him in the hospital corridor, lost, terrified, but somehow trusting, had awakened something long dormant within him. When Richard entered the kitchen, he found Oliver nibbling at a sandwich, his legs dangling from the tall kitchen stool. Mrs. Hoffman was chatting gently, not expecting responses but filling the silence with comforting normality. "I've had the blue room prepared," she informed Richard. "It's closest to yours and gets nice morning light." "Thank you," Richard replied, struck by her efficiency. "Oliver, when you're finished, we'll get you settled." The boy nodded, carefully placing his half-eaten sandwich back on the plate. "I'm not very hungry," he admitted. "May I be excused?" The formal politeness from someone so young caught Richard off guard. It spoke of a child who'd learned to navigate an adult world too early. He led Oliver upstairs to the blue room, a guest suite he couldn't remember ever being used. Despite Mrs. Hoffman's quick preparations, the space felt impersonal, with its antique furniture and muted color scheme. Nothing like a child's room should be. Oliver placed his backpack carefully on the bed, which was so high he'd need to climb to get in. "Is this okay?" Richard asked, suddenly anxious about the accommodations. Oliver nodded solemnly. "It's very nice, thank you." He glanced around, then added hesitantly, "Will you be far away?" The vulnerability in the question made Richard's chest tighten. "No. My room is just down the hall, and Mrs. Hoffman stays in the East Wing if you need anything during the night." "Okay." Oliver sat on the edge of the bed, looking impossibly small against the ornate furniture. "What happens now?" It was the question Richard had been dreading, because he had no answer. What did happen now? Tomorrow they would need to discuss funeral arrangements, contact the school, deal with a mountain of practical matters. But tonight? Now, I think you should try to get some rest, Richard said gently. It's been a long day. Oliver nodded again, but made no move to unpack or prepare for bed. He just sat there, hands folded in his lap, as if waiting for further instructions. Do you need help getting ready for bed? Richard asked awkwardly, realizing he had no idea what an 8-year-old might need. No, sir, I can do it myself. Oliver slid off the bed and unzipped his backpack, removing neatly folded pajamas. My mom taught me. The mention of Sarah made the air heavy again. Richard shifted uncomfortably, backing toward the door. Well then, good night. If you need anything, just come find me. He turned to leave, but Oliver's voice stopped him. Mr. Blackwood? Richard looked back. Yes? Thank you for not leaving me at the hospital. The boy's voice trembled slightly. The lady from social services was scary. Richard felt something crack in his carefully maintained facade. You're welcome, Oliver. Try to sleep now. As he closed the door, Richard leaned against the wall, suddenly exhausted. What had he gotten himself into? He was wholly unprepared for this responsibility, for the weight of a child's trust and grief. Later that night, Richard was awakened by a sound. Standing in his doorway was Oliver, tears streaming down his face, clutching a worn teddy bear that must have been packed in his backpack. I had a bad dream, the boy whispered. Mom was calling for me, but I couldn't find her. Richard sat up, completely out of his depth. Do you want to talk about it? Oliver shook his head, then asked in a barely audible voice, could I stay with you just tonight? I promise I won't bother you. The request was so modest, so heart-wrenching in its restraint that Richard found himself nodding. Of course. As Oliver curled up on the far side of the king-sized bed, Richard realized that his life had irrevocably changed. The walls he'd spent decades building now had a child-sized hole in them, and he had no idea how to patch it, or if he even wanted to. The funeral home sat nestled between a florist and a small cafe, its brick facade somber against the bright autumn day. Richard adjusted Oliver's tie, a miniature version of his own dark silk one, noting how the boy stood unnaturally still, as if afraid any movement might shatter what remained of his world. Ready? Richard asked quietly. Oliver looked up, his blue eyes hollow with grief. Do lots of people come to funerals? He asked instead of answering. Richard hesitated. Sarah Mitchell had been a single mother who cleaned tombstones for a living. Her circle appeared small, and Richard had found no extended family despite his resources. The guest list would be painfully short. Sometimes, he replied carefully. But what matters is that the people who loved your mother are there. Oliver nodded solemnly. That's just me, and maybe the people at the cemetery who knew her. He looked down at his polished shoes, new ones Richard had purchased yesterday along with a proper suit. Is that enough? The question carried such weight that Richard felt momentarily breathless. Was a life valued by the crowd at its passing? He thought of his own parents' funerals, his father's packed with business associates who feared missing an appearance, his mother's smaller but still filled with society figures who came out of obligation rather than affection. More than enough, Richard assured him. And I'll be there too. Oliver's small hand slipped into his, a gesture that had become frequent over the past 2 days. The contact still startled Richard, but he no longer tensed at it. Inside, the funeral director, a Mr. Simmons, guided them with practiced solemnity toward the viewing room. Richard had spared no expense, ignoring the man's surprise when he'd selected the premium casket and arrangements for someone whose funeral costs would normally be a concern. Would you like a moment alone with your mother? Mr. Simmons asked, Oliver gently. The boy looked panicked, squeezing Richard's hand tighter. Can Mr. Blackwood come with me? Of course, the director nodded, opening the door for them. The room was simple but elegant, with tasteful flower arrangements, white lilies and roses, surrounding the casket. Sarah Mitchell lay peacefully, looking far less pained than during her final hours. She'd been dressed in a blue dress Richard had purchased, as Oliver had explained that his mother's favorite dress had been sold months ago to pay the rent. Oliver approached slowly, still clinging to Richard's hand like a lifeline. When they reached the casket, the boy simply stared, his expression unreadable. "She looks like she's sleeping," he whispered finally, "but different." Richard remained silent, unsure what wisdom he could possibly offer. "I brought something," Oliver said, reaching into his pocket with his free hand. He pulled out a small worn bracelet made of colorful beads. "Mom made this with me last year. She said as long as I had it, she'd always be with me." His voice wobbled. "But I think she should have it now." With trembling fingers, Oliver placed the bracelet in his mother's folded hands. The sight of something so vibrantly childish against the funeral's somber backdrop made Richard's throat tighten unexpectedly. "Do you think that's okay?" Oliver asked, looking up at Richard with uncertainty. "I think it's perfect," he managed to reply. "Your mother would be honored." They stood in silence for another moment before Oliver whispered, "Goodbye, Mom. I'll try to be brave like you always told me." Then, unexpectedly, he added, "Don't worry about me. Mr. Blackwood is taking care of me." The simple statement of faith, from a child who barely knew him, landed like a physical weight on Richard's shoulders. He'd made no long-term promises, had no concrete plans beyond these immediate days. Yet Oliver spoke with complete confidence in his protection. The service itself was brief but dignified. As Richard had predicted, few people attended, just a handful of cemetery workers and 2 women from Sarah's apartment building. Oliver sat beside Richard in the front row, remarkably composed until the final prayer, when silent tears began tracking down his cheeks. Without thinking, Richard placed an arm around the boy's narrow shoulders. Oliver leaned into him immediately, accepting the awkward comfort without hesitation. As they prepared to leave for the cemetery, one of the neighbor women approached them. "You must be the gentleman taking care of Oliver," she said, her expression a mixture of curiosity and concern. "I'm Deborah from apartment 4C. Sarah spoke very highly of you." Richard blinked in confusion. Sarah hadn't known him. They'd met only in her final hours. The woman seemed to sense his bewilderment. "Oh, she didn't mention you by name. But these past months, as she got sicker, she kept telling Oliver that someone would come for him when she couldn't take care of him anymore. Someone important who would give him a better life." She smiled sadly. She had such faith that the right person would appear when needed. "I thought it was just, a mother trying to comfort her son." Richard felt a chill run through him. Had Sarah somehow known, or had she simply been desperate enough to believe that salvation would arrive? "I didn't know her well," he admitted. "But you're helping her son," Deborah said. That would have meant everything to her. At the cemetery, Oliver insisted on visiting, the section where his mother had worked. He walked among the headstones, touching them gently. "Mom made them all shine," he explained, a hint of pride cutting through his grief. "She said everybody deserves to be remembered properly." He looked up at Richard. "Can I still come visit these sometimes, to make sure they stay clean?" The request was so unexpected, so deeply reflective of the boy's connection to his mother, that Richard found himself nodding without hesitation. "Of course, we can come whenever you want." After Sarah was laid to rest under a maple tree, its leaves blazing red and gold, the small group dispersed. Richard and Oliver remained, standing hand in hand before the fresh grave. "What happens now?" Oliver asked, the same question he'd posed that first night, but carrying even more weight. Richard looked down at the boy, this child who had literally grabbed hold of his sleeve and, in doing so, somehow taken hold of something deeper inside him. "Now we go home," he said simply, surprising himself with how natural the words felt. "And we figure out the rest together." As they walked back to the car, Oliver paused, looking back at his mother's grave one last time. "I think she sent you," he said quietly, "to find me that day. Mom always said angels don't always have wings, sometimes they wear suits." Richard, The man who had built his fortune on hard facts and cold logic found himself without a rational response. So he simply squeezed the small hand in his and led Oliver home, wherever that might eventually be. The morning after the funeral dawned, gray and drizzly, matching the somber mood that hung over Richard's mansion. Oliver had barely spoken during breakfast, pushing cereal around his bowl while staring out the rain-streaked windows. The weight of finality had settled upon his small shoulders. His mother was truly gone, and the world had continued turning, despite it. Richard watched the boy from over his coffee cup at a loss for what to do next. Grief wasn't something you could fix with money or influence. In business, Richard always had a strategy, a clear path forward, but here, with this child's broken heart, he felt utterly powerless. "Oliver," he said finally, setting down his cup. "I was thinking we might do something different today." The boy looked up, mild curiosity breaking through his melancholy. Like what? Richard hadn't actually planned this far ahead. He'd spoken on impulse, driven by the need to see something other than sadness in those blue eyes. "Something fun," he replied, the word feeling foreign on his tongue. When was the last time he'd done anything purely for enjoyment? "What do you like to do for fun?" Oliver's brow furrowed as if the question required deep consideration. "Mom and I used to go to the park when she felt good, and sometimes the library for story time." He hesitated, but that was before she got really sick. Richard nodded, trying to mask his dismay. The boy's idea of fun was heartbreakingly modest, born of a life with limited resources and a mother struggling against illness. "What about an amusement park?" Richard suggested suddenly. "With rides and games?" Oliver's eyes widened. "I've never been to one. Mom said maybe someday." His voice trailed off, the unfinished promise hanging painfully between them. "Then it's decided," Richard said, standing with newfound purpose. "Go put on something comfortable. We're going to Wonderland Park." 40 minutes later, they pulled into the parking lot of the region's largest amusement park. Despite the dreary weather, Oliver pressed his face against the window, marveling at the towering roller coasters and colorful attractions visible beyond the entrance. "It's enormous," he breathed, a spark of genuine excitement in his voice for the first time since Richard had met him. As they approached the ticket booths, Richard bypassed the lines and headed straight for the VIP entrance. The attendant recognized him immediately. "Mr. Blackwood, what a pleasure. We weren't expecting you today." She glanced curiously at Oliver. "My." Richard paused. What was Oliver to him exactly? "My young friend and I would like the full VIP experience today." Inside, the park was a sensory explosion of lights, music, and the mingled scents of cotton, candy, and caramel apples. Oliver walked close to Richard, occasionally reaching for his hand when the crowds thickened. "What would you like to try first?" Richard asked, surveying the attractions. Oliver pointed hesitantly toward the giant Ferris wheel that dominated the park's center. "Could we go on that? You can see everything from up there." They made their way to the Ferris wheel, bypassing the line with their VIP passes. As they settled into the swinging car and began their ascent, Richard noticed Oliver's hands gripping the safety bar with growing intensity. "Are you afraid of heights?" he asked gently. Oliver shook his head, but his knuckles were white. "Not afraid, just, it's so high." "We can ask them to stop it if you're uncomfortable." "No," Oliver said quickly. "I want to see the view from the top." As their car reached the apex of the wheel, the entire park spread out below them in a dazzling panorama of color and movement. Oliver's anxiety transformed into awe. "Wow," he whispered, momentarily forgetting to be afraid. "You can see everything." Richard found himself watching the boy's expression rather than the view. The simple wonder on Oliver's face stirred something long forgotten within him, a memory of his own childhood wonder, before ambition and loss had hardened him. "It's quite something," he agreed. When they disembarked, Oliver's initial nervousness had vanished. "Can we try the bumper cars next?" Over the next few hours, they explored the park, riding everything from gentle carousels to moderately thrilling boat rides. Richard drew the line at the more extreme roller coasters, citing Oliver's age rather than admitting his own discomfort with such attractions. At the carnival games section, Oliver stopped before a ring toss booth, watching intently as other children tried and failed to win the large stuffed animals displayed as prizes. "Would you like to try?" Richard asked. Oliver hesitated. "Those games are really hard," Mom said. "They're designed so you can't win." "Your mother was right," Richard replied, impressed by Sarah's honesty. "But sometimes the fun is in trying anyway." He paid for a round of rings, and Oliver carefully tossed them one by one. Predictably, none landed around the bottlenecks. The boy seemed unsurprised but slightly disappointed. "Let me try," Richard said, paying for another round. His first few tosses were equally unsuccessful, but on his final ring, whether by skill or luck, it caught on a bottleneck and settled into place. The attendant's surprise was evident as he invited Richard to choose a prize. Richard gestured to Oliver, who selected a medium-sized pink teddy bear with a slightly crooked smile. "Thank you," Oliver said, hugging the bear to his chest. "This is my first prize ever." As afternoon faded into evening, they settled on a bench, with cotton candy, watching the park lights come on as dusk approached. Oliver, tired but clearly happier than he'd been in days, leaned slightly against Richard's arm. "Did you have fun today?" Richard asked. Oliver nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I didn't think I could have fun anymore. Not after Mom." He trailed off, then continued in a smaller voice. "Does that make me bad? Having fun when she's gone?" Richard felt wholly inadequate to answer such a profound question, but he tried anyway. "No, Oliver. Your mother wanted you to be happy. I think she'd be glad you had a good day." The boy seemed to consider this, then looked up at Richard with those penetrating blue eyes. "Have you ever been to an amusement park before?" The question caught Richard off guard. "Not since I was very young," he admitted. "Did you have fun today?" Oliver asked, turning Richard's own question back on him. Richard was about to give a polite, non-committal answer, but found himself saying instead, "Yes, I did. More than I've had in a very long time." Oliver smiled. A real, unguarded smile that transformed his face. Maybe we both needed this. As they walked back to the car, Oliver's teddy bear tucked securely under his arm, Richard realized the day had changed something fundamental between them. They were no longer just two strangers thrown together by circumstance, but something more, though exactly what, he couldn't yet define. That night, after Oliver had gone to bed, Richard sat in his study reviewing work emails he'd neglected all day. He found himself unable to focus, his mind repeatedly drifting back to the image of Oliver's smile on the Ferris wheel, the sound of his laugh during the bumper car ride. For the first time in decades, Richard Blackwood had spent an entire day doing nothing productive or profitable, and yet somehow it felt like the most worthwhile day he'd had in years. His phone rang, displaying his lawyer's name. Richard answered, knowing what the call would be about. "The temporary guardianship is in place," Harold confirmed, "but if you want something more permanent, we need to discuss options. Foster care placement is still the most likely outcome unless—" "No," Richard interrupted, surprising himself with his vehemence. "No foster care. I gave his mother my word." There was a pause on the other end. "Richard, are you considering—" "I don't know what I'm considering," he admitted, "but I do know I'm not ready to let him go yet." After hanging up, Richard walked upstairs to check on Oliver. The boy was fast asleep, the pink teddy bear clutched to his chest, his face peaceful for the first time since Richard had met him. Something protective and fierce stirred within Richard's chest as he quietly closed the door. Whatever came next, one thing was becoming increasingly clear. Oliver Mitchell had somehow found his way past all of Richard Blackwood's carefully constructed defenses and into a heart he'd long assumed was impenetrable. The harsh ring of the EY's doorbell shattered the peaceful morning atmosphere at Richard's estate. It had been exactly 1 week since Sarah Mitchell's funeral, and a fragile new routine was just beginning to take shape. Oliver was slowly adjusting to life in the mansion, even showing occasional flashes of childlike animation, particularly during their daily visits to the garden. Richard looked up from his newspaper, checking his watch with a frown. He wasn't expecting visitors, and unscheduled interruptions were rare at his closely guarded residence. Mrs. Hoffman appeared in the doorway of the breakfast room, her usually composed face bearing an unmistakable look of concern. "Mr. Blackwood, there are people here to see you. A Mr. Reynolds from Child Protective Services and—" She hesitated. "A man claiming to be Oliver's father." Richard felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. He glanced at Oliver, who was contentedly arranging banana slices into a smiley face on his pancakes, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing in the foyer. "Oliver," Richard said carefully, "why don't you finish your breakfast in the kitchen with Mrs. Hoffman? I need to speak with some visitors." The boy looked up, sensing the tension in Richard's voice. "Is something wrong?" "Nothing for you to worry about," Richard assured him, forcing a smile that felt brittle on his face. "Just some business to attend to." Once Oliver was safely in the kitchen, Richard straightened his tie and walked to the foyer with measured steps, mentally preparing himself as he would before a high-stakes negotiation. Two men stood waiting. The first was clearly a government official, middle-aged with a worn briefcase and the weary expression of someone who had seen too many difficult situations. The second man was younger, perhaps in his early 30s, with dark hair and a casual demeanor that seemed deliberately cultivated. Something about his calculating gaze immediately put Richard on edge. "Mr. Blackwood?" The older man stepped forward. "Thomas Reynolds, Department of Child Protective Services. And this is Marcus Ward, who has presented documentation indicating he is Oliver Mitchell's biological father." Richard assessed Marcus Ward with a businessman's practiced eye. The man's clothes were fashionable but showed signs of wear. His watch was an impressive knockoff of a luxury brand. His shoes needed polishing. Everything about him screamed of someone trying to appear more successful than he was. "I wasn't aware that Oliver's father was involved in his life," Richard said carefully. "The boy has never mentioned him." Marcus shrugged, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "Sarah and I had our differences. She kept me away from my son." He sighed dramatically. "When I heard about her passing, I knew I had to step up. Blood is blood after all." Richard maintained his composure, though anger flared within him at the casual way Marcus referenced Sarah's death. "How exactly did you hear about Sarah's passing, and why appear now after the funeral?" Marcus's expression hardened momentarily before smoothing back into practiced affability. "News travels, and I came as soon as I could. Look, I appreciate you stepping in temporarily, but Oliver belongs with his father." Mr. Reynolds cleared his throat. "Mr. Blackwood, while your temporary guardianship was approved under emergency circumstances, Mr. Ward has presented a birth certificate listing him as Oliver's father. Legally, this gives him strong standing for custody." Richard felt the control of the situation slipping away. He had extensive resources and connections, but family law prioritized biological relationships, even with parents who had been absent for years. "I understand the legal technicalities," Richard replied coolly, "but I made a promise to Oliver's mother in her final moments. The boy has suffered tremendous trauma. Uprooting him again, especially to place him with someone he doesn't know, would be devastating." "With all due respect," Marcus countered, his tone suggesting anything but respect. "You're the one he doesn't know. You've had him what? A week? I'm his father." "A father who hasn't been present for 8 years, Richard stated flatly. Marcus's eyes narrowed. "Careful, Blackwood. You don't know our history." "I'd like to speak with Oliver," Mr. Reynolds interjected, clearly trying to diffuse the tension. "Standard procedure requires that I assess his current living situation and speak with him privately." Richard nodded stiffly. "Of course. But I would ask that you not mention Mr. Ward's presence until we've discussed how best to approach this. Oliver has experienced enough trauma recently." Reynolds agreed, and Richard led him toward the kitchen, leaving Marcus in the foyer under the watchful eye of his security personnel. As they walked, Richard spoke quietly. "Mr. Reynolds, I don't know what Marcus Ward has told you, But Oliver has never once mentioned his father. Sarah was raising him completely alone while battling terminal cancer and working a physically demanding job. The social worker's expression softened slightly. I understand your concerns, Mr. Blackwood, but I have to follow protocol. Mr. Ward has legal rights that can't be dismissed without due process. In the kitchen, Oliver looked up from his pancakes, his expression immediately wary at the sight of the stranger with Richard. Oliver, Richard said gently, this is Mr. Reynolds. He'd like to talk with you for a few minutes about how you're doing here. It's routine. The boy's eyes darted between them, instantly alert to the undercurrents of tension. Am I in trouble? Not at all, Reynolds assured him with a practiced smile. I just want to chat. Richard reluctantly left them alone, returning to the foyer where Marcus Ward was examining an antique vase with too much interest. Nice place you've got, Marcus commented, setting the vase down carelessly. Must have cost a fortune. What do you want, Mr. Ward? Richard asked bluntly, dispensing with pretense. Marcus's smile turned calculating. What any father wants, to be with his son. After 8 years of absence, people change, Marcus shrugged. I've sorted myself out. Got a steady job now. Small apartment, but it's in a decent neighborhood. Oliver would have everything he needs. Richard studied the man's face. Everything except the stability and security he's just beginning to find here. Why now, Mr. Ward? What's your real interest in Oliver? Marcus's affable mask slipped for a moment, revealing something harder underneath. He's my kid. I don't need another reason. Before Richard could respond, Reynolds returned with Oliver, whose expression was unreadable. The social worker's professional demeanor couldn't quite hide his concern. Oliver seems to be adjusting well here, Reynolds noted. He speaks very highly of you, Mr. Blackwood. Oliver moved immediately to Richard's side, a gesture that wasn't lost on anyone in the room. Marcus's eyes narrowed slightly as he watched. Mr. Blackwood, Reynolds continued, I'll need to schedule a formal home evaluation, and there will need to be a hearing regarding permanent custody arrangements. Of course, Richard agreed, placing a protective hand on Oliver's shoulder. My lawyers will coordinate with your office. After Reynolds and Marcus finally departed, with the latter promising to see Oliver very soon, Richard found himself facing the boy's questioning gaze. Who was that other man? Oliver asked, his perceptiveness once again catching Richard off guard. The one in the hallway. I saw him. Through the door. Richard hesitated, weighing honesty against protection. His name is Marcus Ward. He says he's your father. Oliver's face drained of color. I don't have a father, he said flatly. Mom always said he left before I was born and never wanted to know us. People sometimes come back into our lives unexpectedly, Richard said carefully. Is he going to take me away? The directness of the question, delivered in Oliver's small, suddenly frightened voice, pierced Richard like a physical pain. No, he answered with more certainty than he truly felt. I promised your mother I would look after you, and I intend to keep that promise. Oliver studied Richard's face intently, as if searching for any sign of hesitation. Finally, he nodded, seeming satisfied. Good, because I don't want to go with him, I want to stay with you. The simple declaration hit Richard with unexpected force. This child, who had known him for barely more than a week, was placing his complete trust in him, a trust Richard wasn't entirely certain he deserved. Yet in that moment, he knew with absolute clarity that he would do whatever it took to honor that trust. Then that's what we'll fight for, Richard promised, realizing as he spoke that for the first time in his adult life, he was preparing to battle for something more valuable than any business deal or financial victory. He was fighting for Oliver. The meeting room at the Family Services building felt oppressively small. Richard sat with perfect posture on an uncomfortable chair, while Oliver fidgeted nervously beside him. Across the table, Marcus Ward lounged with practiced casualness, though his eyes remained sharp and calculating. A social worker supervised this first official visit, a woman named Ms. Chen with kind eyes and a notebook she occasionally wrote in. Her presence was the only reason Richard had agreed to this meeting at all. Oliver, Marcus leaned forward with an ingratiating smile. I've been looking forward to meeting you properly. The last time I saw you, you were just a baby. Oliver stared at his own hands, refusing to make eye contact. Mom never talked about you, he said quietly. Marcus's smile tightened. Your mom and I had complicated grown-up problems, but that doesn't change the fact that I'm your dad. Richard noticed Oliver's shoulders tense at the word dad. The boy had never used that term for either of them. I have a room all ready for you, Marcus continued, pulling out his phone to show pictures of a modestly furnished bedroom. It's not fancy like where you're staying now, but it'll be all yours. Oliver glanced at the phone briefly, then at Richard, as if seeking reassurance. Richard gave him a small nod, encouraging him to engage despite his own misgivings. I like where I am now, Oliver finally responded, his voice small but determined. Marcus's expression darkened momentarily before he recovered. Of course you do. Who wouldn't like living in a mansion? But there's more to home than big rooms and fancy things. There's family. Blood family. Mr. Ward, Miss Chen interrupted gently. Perhaps tell Oliver about yourself, your work, your interests. For the next 20 minutes, Marcus talked about his job at an auto parts store, his apartment, and his hobbies. Throughout his monologue, Oliver remained silent, answering direct questions with one-word responses. When the meeting finally concluded, Marcus stood and extended his hand to Oliver. I know this is weird right now, but we'll get to know each other. You'll see. Blood always tells. Oliver hesitantly shook the offered hand but withdrew quickly. As they left the building, Richard felt the boy's small fingers slip into his hand. Do I have to go live with him? Oliver whispered once they were in the car. Richard gripped the steering wheel, choosing his words carefully. The courts haven't decided anything yet. But I promise you, Oliver, I'm doing everything I can to keep you with me. He feels like a stranger, Oliver said, staring out the window. Worse than a stranger. At least strangers don't pretend they know you. That night, Oliver woke screaming from a nightmare. Richard rushed to his room to find him tangled in sheets, tears streaming down his face. He was taking me away. Oliver sobbed as Richard awkwardly comforted him. He was pulling me away from you and you weren't stopping him. Richard held the trembling boy, making a silent vow that would shape all his actions in the coming days. That will never happen, he promised. I won't let anyone take you anywhere you don't want to go. Richard's home office had transformed into a war room. Files covered his normally pristine desk, legal pads filled with notes stacked beside his computer. For 3 days straight, he'd been working with his legal team, fighting for Oliver with the same ruthless determination that had built his business empire. We need more, Richard insisted, pacing as he spoke to Harold Fraser, his lead attorney. Ward's sudden appearance is too convenient. Nobody goes 8 years without contact, then suddenly develops paternal instincts. Harold nodded, adjusting his glasses. My investigators are digging deeper. So far, we've found sporadic employment, some minor legal issues, parking tickets, one noise complaint, but nothing that would automatically disqualify him from parental rights. Keep looking, Richard urged. There's something off about him. I can feel it. A soft knock interrupted them. Oliver stood in the doorway, hesitant to enter what had clearly become adult territory. Mrs. Hoffman said dinner's ready, he announced, eyes darting curiously over the paperwork. Richard immediately stepped away from the desk. Thank you, Oliver. We'll be right there. After Harold departed, promising updates by morning, Richard found himself alone with Oliver in the dining room. The boy picked at his chicken, unusually quiet even by his standards. Everything okay? Richard asked, recognizing the signs of something weighing on the child's mind. Oliver set down his fork. Am I worth all this trouble? The question hit Richard like a physical blow. What do you mean? You're working all the time now, having meetings, looking worried. Oliver's eyes remained fixed on his plate. It's all because of me. Richard set down his own utensils, turning his full attention to the boy. Oliver, look at me. He waited until those blue eyes reluctantly met his. You are not trouble. You are worth everything I'm doing and more. But your life was easier before me. Easier isn't always better, Richard replied, surprised by how deeply he meant it. Before you arrived, my life was empty in ways I didn't even recognize. Oliver considered this, then asked the question that had clearly been troubling him most. What if he wins? What if the judge makes me go with him? Richard felt his jaw tighten. He wanted to promise victory, to guarantee that no court would ever separate them. But he'd learned long ago that false promises did more harm than hard truths. I can't promise what a judge will decide, he admitted, but I can promise that I will fight with everything I have to keep you safe and where you want to be. And no matter what happens, you will never be alone again. Oliver nodded slowly, processing this answer. Then, with the resilience that continually amazed Richard, he picked up his fork and took a bite of chicken. I think we should get a dog, he announced, changing subjects with childlike abruptness. Richard blinked at the non sequitur. A dog? Yeah, a big one that can sleep on my bed. Oliver's eyes held a glimmer of their old sparkle. Every kid should have a dog. For the first time in days, Richard laughed, a genuine, unguarded sound that seemed to lighten the atmosphere. Immediately. Let's deal with one thing at a time, he said, but didn't outright refuse, recognizing the request for what it was. Oliver's way of saying he planned to stay. Later, after tucking Oliver in, a ritual that had developed naturally between them, Richard returned to his office newly energized. He wasn't just fighting against Marcus Ward now. He was fighting for the future Oliver deserved, one that increasingly Richard couldn't imagine without himself in it. Richard's hands gripped the newspaper so tightly that the pages crumpled. The headline glared back at him. Billionaire blocks father from reuniting with son. Beneath it was a sympathetic profile of Marcus Ward, portrayed as a humble working man fighting against Richard's wealth and influence to reconnect with his child. Damn it, Richard muttered, tossing the paper aside as Harold entered his office. See, you've seen the morning news, his lawyer said grimly. It's not just the Chronicle. Ward's given interviews to 3 different outlets. Richard's jaw tightened. He's playing the underdog card. Effectively, Harold agreed. The court of public opinion loves a David versus Goliath story, and right, now you're being cast as Goliath. Before Richard could respond, Mrs. Hoffman appeared at the door, concern etched on her face. Mr. Blackwood, Oliver's school just called. There's been an incident. Richard was on his feet instantly. What happened? Is he hurt? No, sir. Some of the children were showing him the newspaper article. He became upset and locked himself in the bathroom. The headmaster thinks he should come home for the day. 20 minutes later, Richard found himself sitting on a bench in the park near Oliver's school, the boy silent beside him. They hadn't spoken during the drive. Oliver had simply stared out the window, his expression unnervingly blank for an 8-year-old. Would you like to talk about what happened? Richard finally asked. Oliver kicked at the gravel beneath his feet. Everyone was looking at me, whispering. His voice was small. Tommy Clark brought the newspaper and said you were stealing me from my real dad. Anger flared within Richard, not at the child who'd taunted Oliver, but at Marcus Ward for dragging a boy already coping with profound loss into a public spectacle. Oliver, he said carefully, what you're going through isn't fair. Adults are supposed to protect children from these kinds of conflicts, not put them in the middle of them. He said in the paper that you're bribing people, Oliver continued, the words tumbling out now, that you only want me because you're lonely and rich. Is that true? The directness of the question, so characteristic of Oliver, demanded equal honesty. Richard turned to face him fully. No, that's not true. When I first met you and your mother, I only wanted to help. But now... He paused, surprised by the emotion tightening his throat. Now I can't imagine my life without you in it. Oliver studied Richard's face with that unnervingly perceptive gaze. Why does he want me now? He didn't before? It was the question Richard had been asking. himself since Ward's appearance. I don't know for certain, he admitted, but we're going to find out. A tentative smile flickered across Oliver's face. I told Tommy Clark that you were more my dad than Marcus ever was, even if you don't share my blood. That's when he pushed me and I locked myself in the bathroom. Richard felt something warm unfurl in his chest. Pride, protectiveness, and a fierce affection that he was finally beginning to recognize as love. You know what? He said, standing and offering his hand. I think we both deserve ice cream. And then we need to prepare for tomorrow's supervised visit. Oliver took his hand, the simple gesture of trust strengthening Richard's resolve. Whatever game Marcus Ward was playing, Richard would not let him win, not when the stakes were Oliver's future. The cafe chosen for the second supervised visit was deliberately public. Richard's attorney had insisted on it after the media stories. Richard and Oliver arrived precisely on time to find Marcus already waiting. A benevolent smile fixed on his face as a waitress fawned over him. There's my boy, Marcus called too loudly, drawing attention from nearby tables. Oliver instinctively stepped closer to Richard. Ms. Chen, the social worker, arrived moments later. Shall we begin? Oliver, perhaps you'd like to sit between your father and Mr. Blackwood? Oliver hesitated, then reluctantly slid into the booth. Richard noticed how the boy positioned himself closer to his side than to Marcus's. I brought you something, Marcus announced, pulling out a handheld video game console. Latest model. All the kids want one. Oliver's eyes widened despite himself. Richard had been conservative with gifts, wary of seeming to buy the boy's affection. Thank you, Oliver said politely, though he made no move to take it. Ms. Chen smiled encouragingly. That's very thoughtful, Mr. Ward. Perhaps you could tell Oliver about your week. Marcus launched into a carefully rehearsed narrative about preparing his apartment for Oliver's arrival. Richard observed how the man's eyes occasionally drifted toward other patrons, as if gauging their reaction to his performance as devoted father. Halfway through the visit, Marcus excused himself to the restroom. The moment he was gone, Oliver relaxed visibly. You're doing great, Richard murmured. Just a little longer. When Marcus returned, his expression had shifted subtly. He leaned across the table toward Richard. You know, Blackwood, I've been thinking about all this legal hassle. Must be expensive even for you. His voice was low, ensuring Miss Chen couldn't quite hear. Maybe there's a simpler solution. Richard stiffened. What kind of solution? Financial. Arrangements can be made, Marcus suggested with a meaningful look. For the right consideration, I might remember some prior commitments that would make fatherhood impractical. And there it was, the confirmation of Richard's suspicions, brazenly stated. Marcus Ward had no interest in Oliver beyond his potential monetary value. Richard maintained his composure, aware of Oliver watching intently beside him. I think this conversation should continue between our attorneys, Mr. Ward. Marcus's smile turned cold. Sure thing, Rich. But remember, blood counts for a lot in court. As they left the cafe, Richard felt Oliver's hand slip into his. He doesn't really want me, does he? The boy asked quietly as they walked to the car. Richard stopped, kneeling to meet Oliver's eyes. No, I don't think he does. But that doesn't reflect on you, Oliver. It reflects on him. Oliver nodded, his expression far too solemn for his age. I knew it. Mom always said he only came around when he wanted something. Richard felt a chill. Your mother knew him recently? I thought he left before you were born. He came to our apartment once, maybe 6 months ago. Mom made me hide in the closet. They argued about money. This was new information, crucial information. Richard carefully asked, Did you tell Miss Chen about this? Oliver shook his head. I didn't think it mattered. Should I have? Richard gently squeezed the boy's shoulders. Oliver, it matters very much. And I think it's time we find out exactly what Marcus Ward has been hiding. Richard's legal team worked through the night after Oliver's revelation. By morning, Harold arrived at the mansion with a thick folder and a triumphant expression. We found Deborah Williams, Sarah's neighbor who spoke to you at the funeral. She's willing to testify that Marcus repeatedly harassed Sarah for money, especially after her diagnosis. Richard, who had barely slept, leaned forward. Is it enough? Combined with Oliver's testimony about hiding in the closet, it changes everything. Harold pulled out several documents. We also uncovered 3 outstanding warrants for unpaid child support in 2 different states. Apparently, Oliver isn't his only abandoned child. Richard felt a surge of cautious hope. Can we expedite the hearing? Already done. Judge Carson agreed to see us tomorrow morning. She was particularly interested when we mentioned Marcus's apparent pattern of behavior. Later that afternoon, Richard found Oliver in the garden, carefully watering the roses Mrs. Hoffman had helped him plant. They're growing, the boy announced proudly. Richard smiled, seeing beyond the tiny plants to what Oliver was really cultivating. Roots, permanence, a future here. Oliver, tomorrow we're going to court. The judge wants to hear about when Marcus came to your apartment. Fear flickered across the boy's face. Will he be there? Yes, but you'll be safe, I promise. Just tell the truth. Oliver set down his watering can, his expression suddenly resolute. I will. Mom always said the truth is strongest. That night, as Richard checked on Oliver before bed, he found the boy sitting up, clutching his teddy bear. What if tomorrow doesn't work? Oliver asked softly. Richard sat on the edge of the bed. Then we try something else. I'm not giving up, Oliver. Not ever. The boy nodded slowly, then asked the question Richard had been waiting for. If we win, can I stay with you? Forever? Yes, Richard answered without hesitation. That's exactly what I want too. The courtroom felt cavernous, its high ceilings and wooden panels intimidating even to Richard, who was no stranger to high-stakes environments. Oliver sat beside him, small feet dangling from the chair, his blue blazer and tie making him look like a miniature businessman. Judge Carson, a stern-faced woman with silver-streaked hair, reviewed documents while the attorneys made their final preparations. Across the aisle, Marcus slouched in his seat, his previous confidence notably diminished after learning about the witnesses lined up against him. All rise, announced the bailiff as proceedings began. The testimonies unfolded methodically. Deborah, Williams described Marcus's aggressive visits to Sarah's apartment, his demands for money, and how Sarah had feared him. Financial records showed a consistent pattern of exploitation. Then came Oliver's turn. Richard squeezed his shoulder encouragingly as the boy approached the witness stand. Despite his obvious nervousness, Oliver's voice remained steady as he described hiding in the closet, hearing Marcus demand money from his sick mother. He said since she was dying anyway, she should give him what she had. Oliver testified, his simple honesty devastating in its impact. Mom was crying. She said she needed it for my future. Marcus's attorney attempted to suggest Oliver was coached, but the boy's unwavering gaze and consistent answers quickly dispelled this notion. When Marcus took the stand, his carefully constructed facade crumbled under cross-examination. Confronted with evidence of his other abandoned children and unpaid support, he lost his temper. Look, the kid's better off with money than with me anyway, he finally snapped. Blackwood wants to play. Daddy, fine, but I deserve compensation for my rights. The courtroom fell silent. Judge Carson's pen stopped moving. Then, with quiet authority, she spoke words that changed everything. Mr. Ward, this court is not a marketplace where children are sold to the highest bidder. You've made your priorities abundantly clear. 2 hours later, the verdict came. All of Marcus's parental rights were terminated. Richard was granted temporary custody with a clear path to adoption. Outside the courthouse, Oliver threw his arms around Richard's waist in a fierce embrace. We did it, the boy whispered. We really did it. The drive home from the courthouse was electric, with a quiet joy neither Richard nor Oliver seemed to know how to express fully. The radio played softly as city buildings gave way to the tree-lined avenue leading to the estate. Richard occasionally glanced at Oliver, who sat with the teddy bear in his lap, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. What are you thinking about? Richard finally asked. Oliver looked up, his eyes brighter than Richard had ever seen. Them. I was thinking about Mom. I think she'd be happy right now. I think so too, Richard agreed softly. When they pulled through the gates, they were surprised to find Mrs. Hoffman standing on the front steps, beaming. Behind her, a banner hung across the entrance. "Welcome home, Oliver," Mrs. Hoffman said. "We should celebrate," Oliver explained, suddenly shy. "I hope that's okay." Richard felt his throat tighten with emotion. "It's more than okay." Inside, they found a chocolate cake on the dining table and a small pile of wrapped gifts. Oliver's eyes widened in disbelief. "Are those for me?" "Every one of them," Mrs. Hoffman confirmed. "Mr. Blackwood arranged it yesterday." The afternoon unfolded in a series of perfect moments. Oliver blowing out candles on the first celebration cake he'd had since his mother's illness began. The boys delighted each carefully chosen gift. The staff's genuine warmth toward the child who had brought life back to the mansion. Later, as evening settled over the estate, Richard found Oliver sitting on the terrace, gazing at the stars. "You know," Richard said, sitting beside him, "I was thinking we might renovate your room this weekend, make it truly yours." Oliver turned to him, his expression suddenly serious. "Can I really stay? Forever?" Richard took a deep breath. "Oliver, if you want, I'd like to adopt you. Legally, you would be my son in every way that matters." The boy was quiet for a long moment, then whispered, "I'd like that very much." As if to seal the moment, a shooting star streaked across the sky, and both of them made silent wishes that, unknown to each other, were remarkably the same. 6 months passed, transforming both the mansion and its occupants. Oliver's room had evolved from a formal guest suite into a vibrant boys' domain, with bookshelves overflowing with adventures, walls adorned with solar system posters, and a dedicated corner for his growing collection of science experiments. Richard, too, had changed. His colleagues barely recognized the man who now scheduled business calls around school pickups and proudly displayed Oliver's artwork in his office. The feared Frost King had thawed remarkably. "Dad!" Oliver called, bursting through the front door one afternoon, waving a paper. "I got an A on my science project." Richard looked up from his laptop, the word "Dad" still new enough to send a warm jolt through him. "That's fantastic. The volcano experiment worked?" "Better than expected," Oliver grinned. "Ms. Peterson said it was the best eruption she's ever seen." That evening, they celebrated with pizza and a movie, one of their new Friday traditions. As they settled on the couch, Richard marveled at how naturally they'd fallen into these routines, creating their own family traditions where none had existed before. "Dad," Oliver asked during a quiet moment in the film, "can I ask you something?" "Anything." "Are you happy? I mean, with me living here and everything changing?" Richard paused the movie and turned to face his son. "Oliver, do you remember when we first met? How I was always working, always serious?" The boy nodded. "I thought I had everything I needed, but I was wrong." Richard smiled. "You didn't just change my schedule or my house. You changed my life. For the better." Oliver beamed, then snuggled closer as Richard restarted the movie. Later, after tucking Oliver in, Richard stood in the doorway watching the boy sleep peacefully, teddy bear still clutched to his chest. The adoption papers sat signed on his desk, waiting to be filed on Monday. Family, Richard had discovered, wasn't about sharing blood. It was about sharing life. And for the first time in decades, his life felt wonderfully, gloriously complete. 1 year to the day since Sarah Mitchell collapsed in Evergreen Cemetery. Richard and Oliver stood before her headstone. The autumn leaves danced around them in the gentle breeze, gold and crimson against the deep green grass. The marble was no longer just another stone in a sea of monuments, but a cherished place where they came regularly, bringing fresh flowers and sharing quiet conversations. Oliver, taller now and more confident, carefully arranged white daisies, his mother's favorites, in the small vase. Richard watched his son's gentle movements, struck by how much the boy had grown, not just in height but in healing. "Do you think she knows?" Oliver asked softly. "Knows what?" Richard placed a supportive hand on the boy's shoulder. That we're okay. That we found each other. Oliver traced his mother's name on the stone. That I'm happy now. Richard knelt beside him, eye to eye with the child who had transformed his world. I believe she knows. I think she might have even had a hand in it. Oliver smiled at this thought. I miss her every day, but I'm not scared anymore. They stood together in comfortable silence until Oliver reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, smooth stone. I brought this from our garden, he explained. From the roses we planted. I thought she might like having a piece of our home. Richard watched as his son placed the stone atop the headstone, a tradition they had started, leaving small tokens of their life together. After a final moment of reflection, they turned to walk back to the car. Oliver's hand slipped naturally into Richard's, a gesture that had once been born of desperation but was now simply connection. Dad? Oliver said as they walked through the dappled sunlight beneath the cemetery's ancient trees. Thank you for finding me that day. Richard tightened his grip on his son's hand, emotion making his voice rough. No, Oliver. Thank you for finding me. As they drove away, the cemetery growing smaller in the rearview mirror, Richard glanced at the boy who had once grabbed his sleeve in desperate need and now sat beside him as his son in every way that mattered. In saving Oliver, Richard had somehow saved himself as well, discovering that the greatest fortune wasn't in his bank accounts but in the love of a child who had chosen him as much as he had chosen the child. Some might call it chance. That meeting, in a cemetery a year ago. But as Richard and Oliver headed home, truly home, they both knew it had been something much more like destiny.